This is the Permission to Write podcast, and I'm your host, Ashley M. Coleman, author of Good Morning Love. Join us each week as writers discuss more than writing. You'll hear from me as well as the occasional guest on craft, publishing, life, and culture. We hope you enjoy the show. All right, so I hope you've been enjoying the guests that we had the last few weeks, but jumping into it today, we're going to talk about this week in publishing. Publishers Weekly says that book sales were up in May, which is always a positive in a volatile book market. We love to hear that the sales are up as authors. The New York Writers Coalition is closing its doors after 22 years of providing free workshops, citing years of struggling to pay bills. It is shattering when these major institutions that support writers go down. And it was just so sad to hear this news about the New York Writers Coalition, which does so much work in regard to diversity, underrepresented writers, etc. But we get it. Fundraising is hard out here in these streets. So please support the organizations that you love, including Permission to Write. Give us some love. Help us out. Make donations. Support our products, our workshops, etc., because some of these institutions are here today and gone tomorrow. And last but not least, the author of the Bridgerton series discusses the change in story for Francesca Bridgerton. So for all the Bridgerton fans, there's a really good article that brings up an interesting thought about adaptations and how closely they should or shouldn't follow the book. So if you are a Bridgertonian, much like myself, you know that there was a little bit of a switch with who we know is going to be an additional love interest for Francesca, from a male character in the book to a woman in the series. But hey, adaptations, they change things in the book. It happens. And so there's a great article. We'll be sure to link to it and tell us what you think. That is a great segue into our Given the Option segment. This is where we option and cast books that who we want to see if the book is actually optioned, which a lot of these books have been optioned, right? But we know that sometimes they'll either make it to the screen or sometimes they don't. But we just like to have a little bit of fun with who we think should be casted for these books in film or TV. So for this week, we're going to do You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. This book is by Akwaeke Emezi, who is just one of my favorite writers. You've probably heard me talk ad nauseum about Akwaeke and their wonderful books. And so to know me is to know how much I fan out about it. And I was not familiar with their work until my debut was marketed with their book, You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. And now I am a full-on groupie for Akwaeke. So I'm reading Little Rock right now, and it's the language for me when it comes to Akwaeke. But in either case, let's cast You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. Okay, so Faye was hella insufferable to me, the main character, but we know that she was fine and black and beautiful with those long braids, right, that were really definitive for her character. And so I'm thinking Jodie Turner-Smith here. I mean, the body deserves its own moment, but she could give me this tortured artist, suffering from the death of her husband 5 years prior to the start of the book. And, it gave me both the daddy and son, thinking she could be fine. She's right in the middle there where daddy and son could be feeling her, digging her. And so that's where I landed for Faye. For her best friend, Joy, Joy is out here dating married women. And she and Faye had a little fling, but decided remaining friends was best in the book. So I have to say that I came across some pics online for DeWanda Wise, and I couldn't top that. She feels really good to me in that role. And so oftentimes, if I can't top who I've been seeing buzzing around about being cast in the books, I'm like, yes, let's stick with it. And DeWanda Wise is such an amazing actress. For Nasir, he was this entitled brat, right? And I think after Mia Culpa, Trevante Rhodes could be in need of a bit of a stretch in a role, something outside of the mysterious deranged artist. But I think my pick for this would actually be Daniel Ezra, with a little bit of Damson Idris on the side if we needed an understudy or something. But I really could see Daniel Ezra in this role, and I'm ready to see Daniel as a full-on adult. He's been in the All-American series, of course, playing like, a high schooler and then a college person. But I'm like, let Daniel Ezra step into his like grown man era for a role. I could totally see it for Nasir. And then online, I saw some bids for Morris Chestnut as Aleem. And I'm like, yes, if the Chestnut is the daddy, then we all understand how Faye would have fell for the daddy. But Aleem was giving me much more of an artsy type of vibe. And I just don't really see Morris Chestnut in that way. Maybe it would be a challenge for him as an actor, but I was thinking about someone more like Lance Reddick, who sadly passed away unexpectedly. He just fit the profile of that like slim, dark, mysterious guy to me. However, Jaimin Hansu could totally give me Forget the Sun, It's the Daddy vibes. Okay, so I would say Jaimin Hansu, who, if you're unfamiliar, which I don't know how you would be at this point, from like Amistad was one of the big films, and he's been in a lot of other things too. And then I don't know why, but Milan was giving me Lil Rel, like the comedian. Like, kind of like the stocky guy. Like, he is cute. Maybe he's not, but he's definitely funny. And, bringing a little comedy or levity into this type of book might not be a bad thing on screen. So I didn't cast the husband originally in my mind because he was kind of this ancillary character. We know that clearly his life affected Faye so much. However, I could totally see them doing a whole flashback scene, maybe even multiple flashbacks in like a film or TV series. I could see it working for that more so than in a book. And so I would say whichever one we don't cast for Nasir, throw him in the dead husband slot. Okay, so whether that's Damson, whether that's Trevante, either one of them could be the dead husband. So that's what I got for this week's Given the Option, but we'll, of course, post on social media. Let us know what you're thinking if you read You Made a Fool of Death with Your Beauty. So for this week's salon topic, I wanted to talk about working with your editor for the first time. So let's get into it. I don't think I've thought a lot about how collaborative books really are. Sure, there's the author who puts together most of the framework, but after that, there's a wide array of folks who help really bring that vision to life. And people who make it a real book, right? So you start with this manuscript, you start with this great idea, but there's all these folks that really come in to shine that thing up, really make it sparkle and sing. And so this week, I wanted to talk about the experience of working with an editor on such a major project like a book. So coming from a more journalistic background, working with an editor for my first novel didn't feel as daunting as it possibly could because I've done that work. In my opinion, my best work was always after someone edited it. I never had that apprehension about like, oh, what is going to happen to my work? I just thought I need the help, right? Like I have the ideas, but I really enjoyed working with editors in more freelance roles because they always just had that subjective point of view. They were always bringing something to the table that I didn't necessarily think about. And I felt like at the end of it, I always had such a better piece. And so, but that was really an experience of working with editors on shorter pieces, right? 1,200, 1,400 words. And when you get to novels, it's a whole different beast. But I never felt like I was uncomfortable with the process of someone else giving input on my work. And so when talking to my initial acquiring editor, I thought she really gets it, right? You have this phone call, you're on submission, you have your book out, and then your agent finally tells you someone's interested, and then you have this phone call and you talk a lot about the book and what that editor's vision for the book is. And so, in that initial conversation with my editor, I had that feeling of like, oh, she gets this book. She was giving comparisons to shows like Insecure and how New York City was also a character in the book, much like LA was for Issa in Insecure. We had such an amazing conversation, and I really felt like, oh, this book is in good hands. Now, that acquiring editor left before the book was published, right? So that here starts the tumultuous journey of what it means to be an author being traditionally published. But, you know, you get used to that idea, right? Because I also have other friends that are authors whose editors have moved all around, right? It happens. It is a wonderful thing if you can stick with the same editor throughout your career, you know, like Toni Morrison and her editor and how long they worked together, and like all these different authors that get that great privilege of just like really having a career with one editor. But for some of us who are just finding our way, starting out with a different publishing industry right now, you might lose your editor, but it's okay. You know, I am actually on editor 3 at my original publisher. However, when I received my first edit letter, I was like, holy hell, right? Like, how am I supposed to do this? When I was working with this new editor who had come on board, thankfully, she had been a part of that acquiring process, because it's not like one editor reads your book and then gives you an offer. No, it is a group decision. There are a lot of flagpoles that book has to get run up to. And so thankfully, this new editor that I was working with was kind of a part of that jury, so to speak, right? That was going to acquire the book. So they weren't completely unfamiliar with it, which was great. And so getting that first edit letter, again, I was like, how the hell am I supposed to do this, right? Because it was overwhelming, if I'm being honest. This wasn't a few comments on a Google Doc to like do a little bit more research or add a line or pull something else from an interview. It was a full out letter. And yes, a lot of comments in the margins of the Word document, but still it was 70,000 words versus, you know, approximately a little more than that. It was versus actually being like 1,400 words, right? Or 1,600 words or whatever the longest piece that I had written in more of a journalistic form. So after the initial existential crisis of it all, because that is going to happen, I thought, what had I gotten myself into, right? Like, I fooled everyone. Don't they know I'm this imposter and no one should ever have given me a book deal? I pulled myself together after that, after all those thoughts, because they're normal. So don't think you're strange if you have them. But after I pulled myself together, I had to figure out my own process for revision. How was I really going to tackle this behemoth of a project, right? How was I going to make this better after I spent years writing this thing? You know, it was like 3 years working on a book, and now it was, okay, there's a lot of good in the book, but there's also a lot of things that we need to strengthen. And so for me, one of the things that I resolved was that it was easiest to go through and essentially change the easy things first, right? So the simple comments, right? A lot of it wasn't so deep. It was me being an amateur novelist and needing to brush up some simple things. Every note, for example, those are things like using that too much or using the same repetitive words. You know, they were calling out those types of things first. And that was what I kind of tried to go through as the initial part of my revision process. And so every note that required a lot more thought, I saved for later, right? Because I didn't want to get stuck anywhere, because that was only going to send me on more of a spiral. And so once I cleaned up all the too many that's or repeating words, all those simple things, then I took the larger themes and ideas really one by one, right? Now I, feel like I was going through to see what edits really served the book and the story that I was trying to tell. And I think it's important to remember that, like, you are in charge of your own book. There's all these people that, yes, collaboratively helped to make this thing come together. But I also feel like we can't lose sight of the fact that this is our baby. This is the story we're trying to tell. And we need to make sure that things are in alignment with that. And so when it came to those bigger themes, they were more thoughtful. Sometimes I would read a note and just like leave for the day and think about the note for the rest of the day, and then I would get up the next day and come back to the page and actually start trying to change or rearrange things. That's one of the important parts I feel about like writing and revision in general. It's like we don't give as much credit to the time that we just need to think about things, like let it marinate. When you're writing a story, it's like those people are in your head all day. And yes, you're going through regular life. You are working, you're momming or dadding or, all the things, right? Like all the duties that call us, you're doing all those things. But those characters are really like marinating in your head. Those storylines are marinating in your head. You see something and you're like, oh, I know how I can kind of tie this plot point together, et cetera, et cetera. So I would take those big themes, think about them, marinate on them, and then I would kind of come to the page. And so I feel like it's always important to note that editors are really making suggestions, right? No matter whether you're writing an article or a book, I think that when we start out as writers, when we're really just getting our feet wet in this process of working with an editor, we assume that the editor just knows best, right? And listen, a lot of times they do, right? But not all the time. They don't always know what you intended. But sometimes a note can challenge you to realize that what you put on the page is not what you meant to get across. And so what they can't know is that, right? They can't be in your brain. They can't know exactly what you intended at all times. And so I always talk about how we were working to beef up a second storyline in my debut novel. And my first editor had made a suggestion that I was really trying to incorporate into the story. I was really trying to inject just a little bit more tension into a secondary storyline for the book. And I was working to make that happen, but it just didn't feel natural to the story. Like once I got in it, once I was playing around, like, I feel like drafts are like clay, and once you get into the material and you're kind of like playing around and trying to like move things around. And it was not what I wanted to convey about Carly's father. It was kind of like involving her parents. And I was like, that's not who I'm trying to make this person to be. And so I didn't use it. I didn't use that suggestion, and I came up with something else that felt more in alignment with the story that I was trying to tell. And once I got to my second editor, I explained that and we went with it. We went with what felt right to me, no matter what felt like it could just make the story more juicy or dramatic. I think it's really important to stick to what you really believe about your characters, how you've set them up to be, the arcs and the themes that you're really trying to convey with the book. And so the best thing I learned within the process of making a book was that it's not done until it's done, right? And even then, there'll be things you want to change, right? Even after that thing is on the shelf, you're still looking at it like, oh man, I could have did a little better with that. But I'm always trying to remind myself that this is creativity when I start to get very rigid about not wanting to change anything in a story. And so I've come across that sometimes where we hold on so tight and preciously to our work and we don't want anybody's real feedback about it. But sometimes I think it's really rooted in fear, like fear that we won't be able to come up with something better than what we so masterfully crafted that first time. And so I think that this like big process, this big notion of like revising this long novel was about getting less precious about the work. And I mean, they know how hard it is to like put together so many words and make cohesive stories, right? And so it's just taking your time with that and understanding that it's okay to really move things around. Like blow that thing up is what I say. Like blow it up, move it around, shift things. I think it's important to get really comfortable with that in revision. So with that, you can try things, you can take suggestions, and guess what? Just save the other versions so that you can always go back to it if what an editor asked you to try didn't work. You know what I mean? That is how you kind of save yourself, make those backups, right, with how you had it originally, and then get in there, play around with it, mold it. Like we talked about, it's clay, it's sculpture, it's creating a thing, but just save those backups. So working through revisions of my book with my editor gave me like this great confidence that I could do this thing, right? Like when the task felt insurmountable in that edit letter, I showed up to it, not necessarily without complaint, or times when I felt like surely I was incapable, but I did it. And it allowed me to know that the first thing that comes to my head isn't always like the best thing that I have, right? And I can continually work to make the writing better. That is such a fun part of the writing process, is when you have this skeleton of a work, this story idea, and then you can go in, you beef it up, you add all these amazing things to the work. I feel like really puts you in this place of like, almost like being a kid again, and actually having some enjoyment outside of all the stress of what it means to write and will it sell and all those things that come into play a lot later, right? And so I enjoyed working with both of my editors in this process. I tried to be respectful of their time, their talent, and their expertise. That meant turning things in on time, being open when I did need a little bit more time. I think there was one moment where book edits were due at the same time as like a very huge work project for me, and possibly like a COVID thing happening. I remember feeling very squeezed and very stressed at a certain point in the process. And so there was crazy times in there where I think I did have to ask for an extension on one of the deadlines. But for the most part, I think I was trying to be really a star author pupil, knowing when to push on certain things and knowing when to ask questions, because there was a lot I didn't understand as a first-time author being traditionally published, and then knowing when to relax, right? And let them take the lead in deferring to their expertise, because this is what they do day in and day out. So like your agent, working with your editor is really like a marriage. And we know how that can go. You can have a flourishing relationship or one from the pits of hell, but you get to choose where it is going to be. So that's it. And that's all I got for you this week. Just sharing a bit of the experience of working with an editor. Let me know if you have questions about that, other things you would want to chat about the experience of what it means to work with an editor. And I will see you all next time. Thank you for listening to the Permission to Write podcast. We hope you enjoyed the show. Plug into our community that works to cultivate and amplify the voices of Black writers and writers of color by visiting permissiontowrite.com. We'll see you next time.